and gentlemen, I'm Scott Foster. I'm Director of the Sustainable Energy Division here at the United Nations in Geneva. I'd like to talk to you today about our so-called Pathways project. It's just coming to a conclusion and we're pretty enthusiastic about the results, and I'd like to share some of those with you. Now, there are a few realities that we've got to talk through. I'll start off with that. Then I'll lay out some of the main conclusions that we draw, and then step you through some recommendations on where we go from here. So let me start with some key starting points, some important points of departure for us. The first one is we've got to recognize that we don't know the future. The future is unknowable. So when we start thinking about pathways to the future, how we're going to get to a destination, we've got to realize that there are lots of influences out there that we can't predict, that are unknowable. And in this project, we've explicitly tried to embrace those uncertainties and the things that we don't know. And that's led to some rich conclusions. The second aspect that is important to recognize is that 80% of today's energy mix is fossil. And there is not a plausible scenario going forward where that share of the energy mix drops below 56%. And that's important to recognize when we think through what the choices are that we've got. The third and very important issue is that every country is unique. Each country's got its own endowment of natural resources, its own cultural and legislative heritage. There's not one pathway that drives each of the countries. They will be unique in their own way. So the challenge we face is how are we going to get a collective outcome for all of the 56 countries of the UNECE region and get them to achieve a coherent outcome. So with that in mind, I'd like to step you through our main conclusions. Go to the first slide, please. The first big conclusion that we have is it is still possible. When we think about getting to 2 degrees, people raise their hands and go, oh my God, that's not possible. When we think about the 2030 agenda, which is dealing with poverty and health and the range of objectives that we've got, they raise their hands and say, oh, that's not possible. The results of our work show that it is indeed possible. We have the technology, we have the know-how, we have the capital to act. The question is getting together the political will and putting together the right signals and the incentives for investment and behavioral changes that cause change to happen. And without those things in place, we will not get there. So when we look, it's absolutely essential that we have a collaborative effort. We must aim for mutually beneficial economic interdependence. That's a fundamental aspect of achieving the objectives. We've got to be forward-looking. We've got to have policies in place for investors. We've got to be pragmatic. We've got to be fact-based. We've got to be realistic. And if we do those things in a sensible way, the world, acting in its own self-interest, will go to the outcomes that we're looking for. And finally, the technology transition is an imperative. We cannot simply rest on our laurels and not make the investments and not let things happen and expect change to occur all by itself. There needs to be an active transition on the technology front. Now, the reality checks, I've mentioned some of these already. 80% of today's fuel mix is fossil-based. When you look around outside, you will see all of the roads with all of the cars, all of the skies with all of the planes. You'll see all of the heating. You'll see all of the energy services driven by a fossil economy. And it's going to be essential when we think through transitioning away from that fossil economy, what's the manner of that transition? And that's an important element of the blockage that we're facing. The second is the P2C scenario that we've developed. P2C is the pathway to 2 degrees scenario. And this really is putting in place the various choices, the various technologies and policies and programs that are needed. Even if we do get to 2 degrees, we still have 56%. Maybe we can do better, but we will get to 2%. 2 degrees with a 56% share of fossil. So we can't ignore fossil, but we shouldn't necessarily accept it as it is. 200 gigawatts of relatively new coal-fired power plants will be still in operation in 2050. That's a reality that we have to keep in mind. We cannot simply say, leave it in the ground. We cannot tell a China, a United States, a Poland, etc., you can't use your coal, because they will. So the challenge we face is getting everybody to be part of the solution instead of identifying parts of the industry as the problem. We can go to the next slide, please. What we find is we've developed here three scenarios. One is the reference scenario. I wouldn't call it necessarily business as usual, but it is a starting point where what countries have committed to. The second one is the NDCs. Countries have made certain commitments under Paris, the nationally determined contribution. They have not yet put in place all of the policies that are required for those, so there is a gap here. But if they only deliver on the NDCs, we still have an increase in CO2 emissions. It's when you get to this P2C scenario where we have cumulative CO2 emissions declining, and you'll notice that they go negative. In particular for the UNECE region, if we want to achieve the global objectives, the UNECE region is going to have some negative emissions on its own part. If I can go to the next slide, please. The challenge is we've got to cut or capture 90 gigatons of carbon dioxide emissions by 2050. So by saying cutting or capturing, that means CCS, CCUS technology, carbon capture and storage, carbon capture use and storage. That also means putting in advanced fossil technology so that the efficiency of using the fossil is improved. That's a challenge because lots of players like to say, let's leave it aground, let's not use it. From our point of view, that's not going to be practical because countries aren't going to do that. So if a country is going to use their fossil anyway, let's get them to do it at the highest efficiency with capture of the CO2 emissions, getting to net zero. A critical aspect of the whole game is getting to carbon neutrality, getting to carbon negative, and advanced fossil technology is part of that game. So we have to focus on systemic efficiency. That means at the production, at the transmission, and at the end use. We have to organize systems so that we're bringing in the best technologies and using pricing mechanisms in a very effective way so that consumption is rational. We've got to capture the emissions. I've talked about that. We've got to have low and negative carbon technologies. Here's where you will have renewables, say biomass, for example, with carbon capture and storage that would deliver a negative CO2 emissions. And then finally, as I've already said with carbon neutrality, that's a first and critical milestone. We're not going to get to sustainable energy being climate and sustainable energy being energy for sustainable development in an integrated way. We're not going to get there if we don't achieve carbon neutrality. Let's go to the next slide then. When we talk about an energy transition, we're talking about a far-reaching change in the system. We're talking about reinventing what we mean by energy, reorganizing who the players are, what the incentives for investment are. We want to absolutely lead to a fundamental shift in how we do energy. The problem there is if we just rush off to say, let's leave it in the ground, let's shut all the coal mines. Associated with those coal mines are the steel mills. Associated with those coal mines and those steel mills are the power plants and the urban environment that's emerged around them. When you think about all of this infrastructure that's in place for the fossil fuel industry today, we can't simply, like Thanos, snap our fingers and have it go away. So there needs to be some sort of just transition. We've got to deal with the social and socioeconomic barriers that impede the transition from actually happening. So we refer to a just transition. Finally, we want to target investments towards the low-income countries. If we've been able to develop, as we have over more than a century, with the emissions that we've had to date, how can we expect a poor or underdeveloped country to forego their own development in the name of climate change, which we ostensibly have caused? Therefore, there needs to be a way for us to invest in the infrastructure and in the economies of the low-income countries that allows them to continue on a developmental path in a way that's aligned with the objectives for climate change and for the 2030 agenda. Next slide, please. We have got to think through sustainable resource management. The way we've been doing resource management today, right now, we're a bit slowed down. Is how are we going to develop the primary resources? How do we value primary resources? Is it simply the market value of the resource? And that's what we've been doing so far. Or do we take account of the social aspects? Do we take account of the environmental aspects? So here at the UNECE, we've developed a United Nations framework classification system. We're transforming that into a sustainable resource management system that will allow a dynamic management of resources in ways that are very consistent with the 2030 agenda. By doing so, we're able to bring and make sure that we've got the critical raw materials that are required for batteries and for other technologies. But we're also able to bring in circular economy, the recycling, using resources that have been previously considered wastes. Let's get that resource balance in a coherent way aligned with what we're trying to achieve. So sustainable resource management and circular economy nexus approaches are critical. Finally, this is the end conclusion here. We've got the lessons learned out of this project. We can do this. We are our own worst enemy. If we've got a way of thinking pragmatically and fairly and forward-looking, there's timely and coherent action is critical. We have to move aggressively and today, but in a way that's fair and just. It's got to be pragmatic. It's got to be fact and science-based, and it has to solve the problems that we're facing. So we've gotten our first, if you will, results from this project. It looks across the entire region. In fact, it takes account of the entire globe. And we find that there are different pressures in the different scenarios of what might happen. Nevertheless, it's clear from our work, we can do this. It is possible. We just have to get out of our chairs and make it happen. So our next step is getting out of the chairs to make that happen. We want to go through and explore country by country and region by region. What are the choices we've got, and how do we put in place the policy and economic signaling frameworks that are needed? I would invite you to go to our website, www.unece.org, take a look at the work we've done here. As we move to the next steps, we actually need your help, so I would invite you to come join us. Thank you very much.